27 people, stranded on a frozen mountain, and a world that had already declared them dead. No food, no rescue, temperatures dropping to -40 every night, and nothing around them but snow, silence, and the wreckage of a plane. Nando Parrado had lost everything before the survival even began. His mother died on impact. His sister took her last breath in his arms. He himself lay unconscious for 3 days. His teammates nearly buried him alive. When he opened his eyes, he made one decision. He was going to walk out of these mountains or die trying. 72 days after the crash, with no gear, no training, and a body reduced to nothing, he did exactly that, on foot, through some of the most merciless terrain on Earth. This is the true story of Nando Parrado.
The date was October 13th, 1972. A chartered Fairchild FH-227 turboprop climbed steadily through the sky above South America, carrying 45 people, mostly young rugby players from Uruguay, along with their friends, family members, and crew. They were heading to Santiago, Chile for a match. The mood on board was light. These were young men in their prime, laughing, joking, passing the hours the way young men do when they believe, without question, that tomorrow is guaranteed. Nobody on that plane had any reason to think otherwise. The Andes Mountains stretch nearly 5,000 miles along the western edge of South America, the longest mountain range on Earth, and one of the most unforgiving. The peaks there don't just rise, they dominate. They block weather systems, create their own climates, and swallow anything that enters unprepared. Pilots who fly these routes know the margin for error is almost nothing. 1 degree off course, one wrong reading of the altitude, one moment of misplaced confidence. That is all it takes. The pilots, believing they had already cleared the mountains, began their descent towards Santiago. They hadn't cleared anything. They were still deep inside the Andes, surrounded by peaks hidden inside thick cloud cover. By the time the mountain appeared through the windshield, there was no time to react. The right wing clipped a ridge first. It sheared off instantly. Then the left wing. The fuselage, the hollow tube carrying 45 living, breathing human beings, became a missile, rocketing down the mountainside at devastating speed, before finally grinding to a stop in a valley of deep snow at an altitude of roughly 11,500 feet. The silence that followed was unlike anything survivors would later be able to describe. Nando Parrado regained partial consciousness some time after the impact. What he found around him made no sense to his damaged brain. Seats torn from their moorings, bodies in impossible positions, the smell of fuel and blood mixing in freezing air. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. His skull had been fractured in the crash, his cheekbone shattered. He drifted back into unconsciousness before he could understand what had happened. Of the 45 people who boarded that flight, 12 died on impact or within hours of the crash. Among them was Nando's mother, Eugenia. She never regained consciousness. She died in the wreckage of the plane she had boarded to watch her son play rugby. His sister, Susie, was still alive, barely. The survivors did what they could. They moved the injured inside the broken fuselage for warmth. They tended wounds with no medical training and almost no supplies. They rationed the small amount of food they found scattered through the wreckage, a few chocolate bars, some wine, crackers, a handful of snacks passengers had carried for the flight. They kept each other conscious through the first night by talking, by arguing, by simply refusing to go quiet. And through all of it, Nando Parrado lay completely still. His teammates assumed he was dying. After 3 days with no sign of recovery, some of them began to discuss the possibility of burying him. They had to be practical. Resources were limited. Grief was a luxury they couldn't afford. They decided to wait 1 more day. On the 4th day, Nando opened his eyes. He did not know how long he had been unconscious. He did not know where he was. When the fog finally cleared enough for him to take in his surroundings, the broken plain, the snow, the towering peaks above him, the faces of his teammates looking down at him with expressions caught somewhere between relief and guilt, he asked the only question that made sense. "Where is my mother?" The silence that answered him said everything. What Nando did not yet know was that his sister, Susie, who had survived the crash with internal injuries, was fading. He pulled himself to her side and stayed there. He held her hand through the nights, spoke to her, refused to leave. 8 days after the crash, Susie died with her brother beside her. In less than 2 weeks, Nando Parrado had lost his mother, his sister, and nearly his own life. He was 22 years old. He was stranded on a frozen mountain that the rest of the world had never heard of, and he had just made a decision so quiet, so internal, that no one around him could have known it was happening. He was not going to die here. But what came next would test that decision in ways he could not yet imagine.
But what came next would test that decision in ways he could not yet imagine. 8 days after the crash, something happened that the survivors had been desperately waiting for. They found a small transistor radio in the wreckage. With trembling hands, they managed to get it working. They huddled around it, convinced that what they were about to hear would be the first step toward rescue. Search teams mobilizing, coordinates being narrowed, help on the way. Instead, they heard the Uruguayan government announce that the search had been officially called off. There was no evidence of survivors. The terrain was too severe. The chances of anyone remaining alive were considered essentially zero. After 11 days, the search and rescue operation was being terminated. The men sat in silence. Think about what that moment actually means. You are alive. You are cold and injured and starving, but you are breathing. You are conscious. You are real. And the world, your government, your families, the entire infrastructure of human civilization has just decided out loud on the radio that you do not exist anymore. For some of the survivors, that broadcast broke something fundamental. The psychology of survival depends heavily on the belief that someone is coming, that your suffering is temporary, that endurance has an end point. When that belief is removed, the mind begins to negotiate with darkness in ways it never would otherwise. Several men wept. Some fell into a silence that lasted days. Nando did not weep. He did not fall silent. He turned to his closest friend, Roberto Canessa, a 19-year-old medical student with a fierce, almost aggressive intelligence, and said something that Canessa would remember for the rest of his life. "We are going to have to get out of here ourselves." But surviving in the Andes at 11,500 feet is not simply a matter of willpower. The human body at that altitude, in those temperatures, with no proper clothing, no shelter beyond a broken fuselage, and almost no food, begins to consume itself. The cold alone is a full-time enemy. At night, temperatures plummeted to -40. The interior of the fuselage, packed with bodies for warmth, barely stayed above freezing. And then there was the food problem. The small supply of snacks found in the wreckage had run out, completely. The survivors faced the reality of starvation with brutal clarity. There was nothing to eat on that mountain. No animals, no vegetation, nothing but snow and rock and the wreckage of the plane. Nothing except the bodies of those who had not survived the crash. The decision that followed is one of the most psychologically complex and morally debated acts of survival in recorded history. It was not made quickly or easily. It was made after days of agonizing discussion, of weighing the impossible against the unbearable, of confronting every cultural, religious, and emotional instinct that said no. They decided to eat the flesh of their dead companions in order to survive. The young medical student, Roberto Canessa, framed it in a way that allowed the others to accept it. These were not bodies, he argued. The souls were already gone. What remained was protein. What remained was survival. What remained was the only thing standing between them and becoming bodies themselves. It was Nando who was among the first to act on the decision. He did not dramatize it. He did not perform anguish for the others. He simply understood that survival required it, and he did what survival required. But surviving the cold and surviving starvation were only two of the threats closing in around them. The mountain, it turned out, was not finished with them yet. By the 16th day, the survivors had established a fragile, brutal routine. They had organized themselves with surprising discipline. Roles were assigned. The fuselage was insulated as best as possible. Food was rationed with painful precision. A roster was kept. Arguments were managed. The group had become, in its own desperate way, a functioning community. And then, on the night of October 29th, the mountain sent an avalanche directly into them. It came without warning, in the middle of the night, while most of the survivors were sleeping inside the fuselage. A wall of snow and ice came down the slope above them and buried the plane completely, sealing the survivors inside in total darkness. 8 people died, suffocated in their sleep, buried alive by the mountain they had been fighting to survive on for over 2 weeks. The ones who remained alive were now trapped inside an airtight metal tube under several feet of snow in pitch darkness, with no way to know if they would run out of oxygen before someone managed to dig an opening. They clawed at the snow with their bare hands. They took turns. They rationed their breathing, consciously slowing down, using less air, because every exhale was one breath closer to the end. It took hours to break through to the surface. When they finally did, they emerged into a world even emptier and more brutal than the one they had left. The avalanche had destroyed supplies. It had reduced their numbers to 27. It had stripped away whatever fragile psychological stability the group had managed to construct. For several days after the avalanche, the situation was as close to complete collapse as it ever got. Some survivors barely moved. Some stopped eating. The group that had been holding itself together with sheer collective will was fraying at the edges. It was in this moment that Nando Parrado made his intention clear and absolute. He was going to climb out of this valley and cross the Andes on foot. He had no mountaineering experience. He had never climbed anything more demanding than a hiking trail. He didn't know what was on the other side of the peaks above him, or how far it was, or whether his body, which had already been through a skull fracture, 3 days of unconsciousness, the death of his mother and sister, starvation, and now an avalanche, could physically endure what crossing those mountains would demand. He didn't care. What he had was the fact that he held on to with the grip of a man clinging to the last solid thing in a collapsing world. His father was alive on the other side of those mountains. Fernando Parrado Sr. was in Uruguay, waiting, not knowing if his son was dead or alive. And Nando, who had already lost his mother and sister, was not going to let his father spend the rest of his life not knowing. That was the fuel. Not heroism, not survival instinct in the abstract. A specific, personal, furious refusal to let his father grieve without answers. He began preparing. But the mountain still had weeks left to make before he was ready to move. And what the survivors were about to discover about the terrain between them and civilization would make everything they had already survived look manageable.
By early December, 72 days into their ordeal, a small expedition group had been selected. Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and a third man, Antonio Vizintin, who would accompany them part of the way before turning back to preserve food for the remaining survivors. They had spent weeks preparing as best they could. Clothing was reinforced. Sleeping bags were fashioned by sewing seat covers together. Aluminum poles from the plane were shaped into walking sticks. Food, the only food available to them, was carefully rationed into small portions for the journey. On December 12, 1972, they set out. What they faced immediately was a slope of approximately 45 degrees, rising to a peak that Nando had convinced himself was the last barrier between them and Chile. He had been watching that peak for weeks from the valley below. He had studied it. He had promised himself that once they climbed it, green valleys and civilization would appear on the other side. It took them 3 days to reach the summit. What they saw from the top destroyed that promise completely. There were no green valleys. There was no civilization. There was no sign of human life in any direction. What stretched out before them was an endless expanse of mountains, peak after peak after peak, disappearing into the horizon, white and silent and utterly indifferent to the 3 half-starved, frost-bitten young men standing at the top, staring into it. Canessa wanted to turn back. Nando refused. This is the moment that separates Nando Parrado from almost any survival story ever told. He was not operating on information. He was not operating on a plan. He was operating on a refusal so complete and so foundational that no amount of visual evidence could overturn it. He told Canessa that he was going forward regardless, alone if necessary. Canessa went with him. Vizintin turned back, sliding down the mountain on an improvised sled, returning to the survivors with his food portion to extend their supplies. And Nando and Roberto walked west into an ocean of mountains, with no map, no communication, no certainty of anything except that stopping meant dying. The days that followed were beyond physical description. They walked on rations that provided a fraction of the calories their bodies were burning. They melted snow for water. They slept on the open mountainside in their improvised sleeping bags, temperatures dropping around them while their bodies tried to generate enough heat to survive until morning. On the 9th day of walking, something changed. The snow began to thin, patches of rock appeared. Then, impossibly, a trickle of water, running water, not melted snow,
but actual flowing water cutting through the rock. Flowing water meant lower altitude. Lower altitude meant warmer temperatures. Warmer temperatures meant they were descending out of the death zone. And then, on the 10th day, Nando saw something that made him stop completely. A tree. One single, unremarkable tree growing from the rock in the distance. He stood there and stared at it for a long time. After 72 days on a mountain with nothing but snow and metal and bone, a single tree was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. They were close, but close in the Andes is still a distance that can kill you, and what happened on the other side of that tree would determine whether any of this, every death, every impossible choice, every frozen night, was going to mean anything at all.
On December 20th, 10 days after leaving the crash site, Nando and Roberto stumbled into the Chilean foothills, hollow-faced, frostbitten, and carrying bodies that had consumed themselves down to almost nothing. They had lost nearly 40% of their body weight. Their skin was cracked and burned from weeks of high-altitude exposure. But they were walking, which meant they were alive, which meant everything. On the banks of the Rio Azul, they spotted a Chilean horseman named Sergio Catalán on the opposite side. The river was too loud for voices to carry across, so they exchanged notes tied to a rock. Nando wrote simply that they were survivors of the Uruguayan plane crash, that 14 more people were still alive on the mountain, and that they needed help immediately. Catalán read the note. He looked up at the two gaunt figures standing across the water. Then he turned his horse around and rode through the night to get help. The following morning, rescue helicopters lifted off from a Chilean air base and headed deep into the Andes. The coordinates Nando had provided from memory alone were accurate enough to locate the wreckage. On December 22, 1972, 72 days after a plane disappeared into these mountains, the 14 remaining survivors heard the sound of rotor blades cutting through the mountain air. They had been declared dead by their own government. They had been buried by an avalanche. They had outlasted everything the mountain threw at them. One by one, they were airlifted off. When the full truth emerged, including the decision to consume the flesh of their dead companions, the world reacted with shock, judgment, and, in many cases, outright cruelty. The survivors didn't hide. They held a press conference, told the truth without apology, and asked the world to judge them only after imagining 72 days on that mountain with no other choice. Nando returned home to Uruguay to find his father waiting at the airport, a man who had spent 72 days suspended somewhere between hope and grief, with no name for what he was feeling. When Nando reached him, that was the moment survival was truly complete. Not the helicopter, not the rescue, his father's arms. He later wrote Miracle in the Andes, insisting it was never about heroism, it was about love, the specific, unbreakable love for his father that pulled him across an ocean of mountains when every rational instinct said it was impossible.